People always say sin is sin, all sin is equal. But is that biblical? And I'm going to show you what the Bible actually shows about what sin is. Is there some distinctions in sin, and how can we know it? And we are glad that you are here, specifically that you've joined with us. We are Requip Ministries, Scott Schneiderman here to partner with you in the ministry that God's called you to. Maybe you didn't know that, but if you put your faith in Jesus, if you are a new creation, you are plugged into the local church. This is never meant to take away. This is only a supplement for you in the local church, because that's what God has designed for you to be within the community of faith. We want to be a supplement for you. If this has been beneficial to you, I want to encourage you to subscribe to this, because you can get the next one and you can just help you get that for that. So we're talking about, is sin sin? You kind of hear that. Now, there's one way to look at this. There's some truth to that, because people will say, all sin's the same. But is that true? I mean, there's some truth to that. So I want to get where some people get that from. Because you'll maybe, if someone points some sin out, well, we're all sinners. They point something, well, hey, we're all sinners. Man, and I love the heart of that, and I love that, and that is true. Like, there is some truth to that. Like, if you've sinned, you're separated from God. Doesn't matter who you are. Doesn't matter what the sin is, because sin is missing the mark. Romans chapter 3, verse 23 says, for all have sinned. Nobody is exempt from this. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. The standard is not doing pretty good. It is the glory of God. And what does that mean? That means the way that God has made you, the way that God has crafted you, we are meant to reflect that glory of God. And when we don't, when we're like a mirror, when we're diverted a little bit, we're reflecting something else. We're bringing something else in. We're showing something else. We have missed the mark. Romans chapter 6, verse 23. He tells us the wages of sin is death. The punishment of any sin, no matter what the sin, it doesn't classify like rape or incest or stealing or malice or gluttony. He doesn't kind of ration these things out, because any of those things that fall short of the glory of God, the design that God has for you. Maybe you're in a sexual relationship that is outside of God's design. Maybe you're talking behind somebody's back and insulting them, and you're gossiping and malice and all those kind of things. You're missing the mark. If I'm doing that, I'm missing the mark. And he tells you, if you're paying with that, you're purchasing that, well, the cost of that is death. That's what he tells it. Very clear. The cost of it is death. Everyone is going to die here on this earth. The Bible also talks about a second death, and that is, talks about hell. Maybe we're going to go a little bit deeper into this. I just had a friend reach out, listen to this podcast, had a question about hell, and I might dig into that in later podcasts. Don't have that lined up for a couple ones. Got to do a little bit of research, and had some great questions, so thank you for that question. And you can always reach me with some questions. You can put a comment. You can find me on social media. You can message me, and I will do my best. And thank you for that. If it's a longer message, requipministries@gmail.com. I will answer that and kind of get into that. And sometimes I've answered some questions on our blog on requip.org, re-quip.org, or maybe I put them in other forms. So there's different ways, but thank you for asking those questions. And in fact, I just want to say this. God loves your questions when you're seeking the truth. There's a way to get after some questions where you're really just asking them so you don't have to follow God. Like, you know what I'm talking about. Well, let's continue back into this. And James chapter 2, verse 10 says, for whatever keeps the whole law, like if anyone keeps the whole law, the punishment of any sin is death, because he gets into this. For if anyone keeps the whole law, yet stumbles in just one point, is guilty of all of it. Like, you can't go to a courtroom after you've broken all these laws. You've done all, like, you have speeding ticket after speeding ticket. You show up in the court of law and you say, well, yeah, but I was really good father. I was a really good mother. Yeah, I broke all those. It's like, well, yeah, but you broke it against the law. So I'm going to hold you accountable to the law. So it doesn't matter if you did some really good things. You're guilty of the law if you're guilty of one of the laws. That's basically what he's telling us there. And Jesus makes it clear, however, that there's some distinctions of sin. Maybe you never thought of it that way. Like, hey, just sin is sin. But there's some distinctions of sin. In Matthew chapter 10, Jesus is sending out his 12 disciples and apostles because he's sending them out to share the gospel, to heal the sick, to cast out demons. He's sending them out because he's trained them up and say, now I want to send you out to do the same type of things that I've done, which in fact he's called all of us to do. And he tells them that some people are going to reject the message of the kingdom. And since I'm sending you out like an ambassador, just like it tells us that today, 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 17 through 21, we are ambassadors. We're sent out like nothing's new. It's the same message that Jesus gave the disciples. But what he tells them here in Matthew chapter 10, basically, because I'm sending you out, you're coming under the authority of the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. If somebody rejects that message, he's going to show some distinction of sin. Matthew chapter 10, verse 15, he says, it will be more bearable on the day of judgment for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah than for that town. Like, that's very clear. He's saying Sodom and Gomorrah because we have a picture, and he's talking to a Jewish mindset, and so Jewish people, they understood Sodom and Gomorrah. Lot's wife looked back, longed back for what this was, and Lot was rescued out of Sodom and Gomorrah by Abraham. And Sodom and Gomorrah was synonymous throughout the Bible, but it was actually a real place where there was homosexuality going on, there was rape going on, there was all sorts of lewdness and just ungodly things that it was just synonymous. It's kind of like when we refer to Las Vegas, for example, Sin City, or maybe it's even New York City or Hollywood or something like that. Like, it's a city that is synonymous with sin. But Jesus is saying whatever level that's at, and he's the only judge, he's the only one that actually knows what that is, but he's saying because the message of the kingdom that I'm sending out, which is greater than the message that Lot brought, it's greater than anything that they had because they didn't have the full revelation. Because the responsibility was greater, the judgment's going to be greater too. And he's saying it's going to be more bearable, like there's some distinction, more bearable for Sodom and Gomorrah than it will be for a town that rejects the message of Jesus. So even from the very beginning, from the sin first entered the world, Genesis chapter 3, we see there's some distinctions and responsibility of sin. Genesis chapter 3, even in marriage, we see the same thing kind of repeated over again because it's that same thing. In Genesis chapter 3, Eve technically sinned first, but the sin that was carried on like a legacy that we talked about last podcast, in a way, where you're saying, I'm glad you're walking in the truth, but what about your family? The man is held responsible for the family. Man, when I remember when I first got this, was revolutionary from me. I always plug this because it is so awesome, but it's a marriage series and curriculum called Love and Respect. I highly recommend that. If you're married, if you're like, I don't really have problems. Like, I didn't think we really had problems, and we did, but I didn't fully know. Like, it wasn't horrible, but man, when we went through Love and Respect, it transformed everything because I finally took on the responsibility that I realized I had. And that's what he's saying here. And even in marriage, for example, a man is not always at fault for sin, but he's always kept responsible for the family. He's let to a higher degree. Ephesians chapter 5, Colossians chapter 3, they repeat the same thing over and over and over. We've all sinned, but there's clearly a distinction and levels of the punishment of sin. However, everyone's sins will be separated from God. And Jesus often taught the punishment was the punishment of hell. But let me tell you the good news, because maybe you're tuning in, maybe you didn't know this, maybe you haven't heard this, and God can speak through this now, and I want to hear from you when he does, that Jesus took your place. You have fallen short, just like me. You have sinned. You have been separated from God. You have missed the mark. You didn't live up to the design that God's put on you. But Jesus took the place. He took the punishment for your sin. All of God's wrath was satisfied on the cross, where Jesus was brutally beaten, hung to death on a cross, bled out, and died on the cross. Then 3 days later, he rose again. He showed himself to be God in the flesh. And Jesus didn't come into the world to condemn the world, but that the world might be saved through him. And anyone who puts their faith in Jesus, anyone who calls on the name of the Lord, can be saved, and that can be you today as well.